Welcome to the next in our study of women of the Bible. And today we're looking at two women from the latter part of 1 Kings, two women that share the same time, but two very different women. Both women associated with the period of Elijah being the prophet. The first, a very well-known name, and I would say a pretty well-known queen, out of Queen Jezebel. So Jezebel was the daughter of Ethbaal, the king of Sidon and Tyre, otherwise known as Phoenicia, an ardent worshipper of Melkart, the Baal of Tyre. In a political marriage designed to cement an alliance between Israel and Tyre, she became the wife of Israel's evil king Ahab. 1 Kings 16 and verse 31. Jezebel's domineering influence on Ahab allowed her to bring a fanatical form of Baal worship with her into her home, into the nation, and even into the temple itself. 450 prophets of Baal joined her retinue, along with a similar number of prophets of Asherah, the female consort of Baal. Corrupt, sensual practices involved in the worship of Baal were observed throughout the country, as Jezebel demanded that her God be considered equal to Israel's God. Her insistence on the equality of Baal with God brought her into direct conflict with Elijah, the prophet of God. Repeatedly, Jezebel had opportunity to see that Yahweh was the true God. Baal was powerless to provide life-giving rains during the drought which occurred as Elijah had prophesied. In a dramatic contest on Mount Carmel, the prophets of Baal were unable to call down fire to their altar, though they danced and chanted, slashing their own bodies, while Elijah taunted them. After Elijah's simple prayer to God for a demonstration of his power to the people, the fire fell on the altar built by Elijah and consumed the sacrifice. 1 Kings 18, verses 23 to 38. Elijah instructed the people to seek out and to destroy the prophets of Baal. Verse 40. This was not the first time that God needed to command this of his people. In raging fury, Jezebel sent word to Elijah that she would do the same to him, that is, to destroy him. Jezebel also focused her royal power to a willful and a wicked advantage. She arranged for the murder of Naboth and the greedy confiscation of his vineyard, which Ahab had coveted. 1 Kings chapter 21 and verse 15. Elijah finally delivered the pronouncement of God's judgment on the royal pair. After Ahab's death, Jezebel wielded her evil power as queen mother during the reigns of her sons. She never repented. Defiant and decadent to the end, she applied facial makeup and mocked the newly anointed king who had killed her sons. The eunuchs of her own household threw her to a gruesome death in the field whose owner she had murdered. Elijah's prophecy that her body would be torn apart by dogs came true. You can read about all of that in 2 Kings chapter 9. Jezebel personifies the principle of reaping what is sown. Galatians chapter 6 and verse 7. She also demonstrates that the power and influence of evil, although allowed by God for a limited time, in chastisement of his own people when they are disobedient, ultimately it never triumphs. Reflecting on Jezebel, it's impossible not to also link it with the story of Elijah, and we have quite a bit about his time during this period after Solomon. After one of his many confrontations with King Ahab and Queen Jezebel of Israel, Elijah was sent by God to hide by the brook Cherith, where the ravens fed him during the drought that he had predicted. When the brook dried up, God instructed Elijah to go to the town of Zarephath, a small town 7 miles south of Sidon on the Mediterranean coast, to stay with a widow whom he had commanded to take care of the prophet. Among the poorest members in the society, this widow apparently had no kinsman to take care of her, and she in turn had to provide for a young son. One of the themes that really runs through this whole study of the women of the Bible is the poverty that is associated with widowhood. And it's certainly a testament that in the New Testament church, very early on, that Christians were instructed to take care of the widows, to provide for them, to look after them, to do so without distinction or prejudice. It's also a shameful blight on the history of how we treat people, that widows, vulnerable, often end up in such circumstances in the first place. Nevertheless, this woman was facing either the wrenching heartbreak of watching her child die before her eyes, or of knowing that her son would be left without love and care if she died first. As a Phoenician, she had no claim upon Israel's God. Notice her words in 1 Kings chapter 17 and verse 12. The Lord your God. In spite of her despair, she still was able to feel some compassion for Elijah as she moved to get him some water. But when he also asked for a small morsel of bread, she revealed to the prophet the seriousness of her own plight. She had only a handful, not even a cup, of flour and a little bit of oil. Destitution was upon her. Elijah's request that she make him a small cake before she prepared food for her son and herself called for a tremendous exercise of faith on the part of this Gentile woman. What elicited from her this response of faith in Elijah's God? Was there something compelling in the tone of Elijah's voice? Was it the desperation that she had so little to lose, since one small meal was all that stood between them and starvation? Clearly she believed Elijah, and she did what he asked, and was rewarded for her obedience by the constant provision of flour and oil from the Lord, just as Elijah had promised. This widow learned to trust God during those days. What must she have felt when her son fell ill and died, after all that miraculous provision? Why had Elijah allowed such tragedy to happen? Had she committed some sin for which her son's death was punishment? Common belief. The days of trusting God for daily provision surely must have made it a bit easier to follow the prophet's instructions. Her joy at seeing her son restored to life was crowned by a deeper degree of faith in Israel's God, the provider for all who trust him. Read further in Luke chapter 4 in verses 25 and 26 about similar scenarios in the providence of God. Thanks very much.